Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be recapping Game 3 of the Western Conference Finals between the Dallas Stars and the Golden Knights. It was a series tied at 1, and going into this Game 3, it would be the Stars taking the victory by a 3-2 overtime win. Now they lead the series 2-1. This one starts off with a Jamie Oleksiak goal, getting a goal for the Stars, which was their first in a very long time. Remember, back in Game 1, they actually scored within the first few minutes of the first period, and as such, they hadn't scored for the rest of that game and for the entirety of Game 2, so a pretty long shutout streak by the Golden Knights ended here with the Oleksiak goal. Eventually it would be tied up by Shea Theodore. Then Jamie Benn would score to make it 2-1, but then later on, just a few minutes later, it would be Mark Stone tying the game up for the Golden Knights, and we'd head to overtime. And unfortunately for those who were maybe gearing up for a long overtime, maybe hoping we'd get at least a few minutes, you'd probably end up being disappointed, as it's Radulov ending it within the first 30 seconds, and as I said, taking the victory here for the Dallas Stars. Good news for the Stars. I don't know what happened here, but all of a sudden Anton Kudobin is seemingly playing out of his mind at this point. He looks like a completely different goaltender from what we saw in the previous series against the Colorado Avalanche. Those were games that he was basically just squeaking out victories in, even though he was letting in 3 goals, maybe 4 goals in every game, just because the Avalanche goaltender was usually just a touch worse than him. And so I thought going up against a goaltender like Lehner or like goaltender like Fleury, who are much better than what the Avalanche were able to field due to their injuries, I thought it would be pretty clear which goaltender would get the advantages in those games, and yet Kudobin has outdueled Lehner, or I guess not technically Lehner. Fleury was playing in Game 1, but has outdueled his counterpart in 2 of the 3 games thus far in this series, and specifically in this one, Kudobin with a fantastic game. Definitely just a huge part of this Dallas Stars victory, and this was my main worry coming in. The Dallas Stars defense was indeed shaky in that series against the Avalanche, but it was something that I could technically see rebounding a bit through these playoffs because it was quite solid during the regular season. But the Kudobin one was not something I was necessarily expecting. I was expecting him to be giving up at least like 2-3 goals a game, but he was very, very good here tonight, and that was a surprise. In terms of bad news for the Dallas Stars, this wasn't necessarily the most well-played game. In fact, it has been sort of a slow decline from how they looked in Game 1. Game 1, it was a pretty solid game from the Dallas Stars. You could definitely argue they were the better team over the Golden Knights, but then in Game 2, the Golden Knights were better. Game 3, you could definitely say the Golden Knights were better still. And so while this ended up being a victory and an overtime for the Dallas Stars, we learned in the previous series between the Canucks and the Golden Knights that a team that is getting outplayed here by the Golden Knights, while they might be able to put up a fight, is eventually not going to be able to win. Now, the good news, of course, is that the Canucks never looked better than the Golden Knights in any of their games, while the Stars have at least have that sort of bastion of hope in Game 1, but still, these past couple of games haven't been great. So the fact that the Stars do have a lead in the series is quite impressive, and we'll see if they can go back to that Game 1 style of play to try and get more games in this series, because right now it's very much wide open, and they could make it to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time in a long time for the Dallas Stars. On the Golden Knights side, their good news is basically what the bad news for the Dallas Stars is the fact that they actually played a pretty decent game here tonight. They fired a lot of shots on net, and they sort of just got stonewalled by Anton Kudobin, which has seemingly become a bit of a theme for the Golden Knights, though I'll get to that a bit later. They scored a couple of goals, which isn't exactly like how it was during the earlier times in these playoffs, but it is still, improvement over what it was the last couple of games of that Canucks series and the first game of this series as well. And so it has been a steady improvement from the Golden Knights, and they seemingly are back to that level of play that we can expect from them. And while it didn't result in a victory here tonight, if they can play like this, it should be able to result in more victories down the line in this series. I should also mention Robin Lehner is sort of not good news, but also not really bad news either. I don't think Lehner had a terrible game here tonight. I will say that Jamie Benn goal was a bit weak, and so in the end he does get outdueled by Anton Kudobin, but this has sort of been the case for Robin Lehner throughout the majority of these playoffs thus far. Yes, he does have 4 shutouts, but he has yet to really do something that has extremely impressed me like we just saw from Kudobin here tonight. Lehner has sort of just been solid for the Golden Knights, and that was the case here tonight, but he just hasn't really been the goaltender to steal a game just yet in these playoffs, and we'll see if that ever does happen. The bad news for the Golden Knights is that the fact that they keep getting stonewalled by these goaltenders, you can say it's unlucky, but at a point, do you have to say that it establishes some sort of pattern here? Back in the first round series against the Chicago Blackhawks, Corey Crawford wasn't insane, but he did look quite good during that series. Then against the Canucks, we saw Markstrom put up a couple of marvelous games, and then all of a sudden Thatcher Demko shows up looking like the second coming of Dominik Hasek or Martin Brodeur and puts up 3 spectacular games, limiting the Golden Knights to just 2 goals in those 3 games, even though they ended up actually still winning that series. And now all of a sudden, Anton Kudobin, who was struggling so hard throughout the majority of these playoffs, and especially in that second round series right before just against the Colorado Avalanche, is now all of a sudden also looking like one of the best goaltenders left in these playoffs. And so you have to wonder, is it the Golden Knights just not really doing enough to get to these goaltenders? I mean, we saw this Mark Stone goal. It ended up being controversial, a goal interference, a challenge for this one. And so it seems as though they are doing those things like getting bodies to the net to try and bother the goaltender, and this results into a goal here tonight. But are they doing it enough? I'm not entirely sure. So it could possibly be bad luck. But you know, the saying goes, like, one time is one time is a tragedy, 2 times is a coincidence, and then 3 times is when you start to become starts to become a pattern. And for the Golden Knights here, it hasn't just been 3 times; it's probably been like 7-8 times at this point during these playoffs. But that will do it for this recap. In terms of predictions, I had said the Golden Knights would take this series in 5 games. That is now impossible. And so while I think the Golden Knights can definitely still win this series, the Dallas Stars have absolutely put up a much bigger fight than I thought, and they might be able to take it. Class dismissed.